At 0130 hours on August 21st, 1942, the black water at the mouth of the Ilu River on Guadalcanal reflected a line of moving shadows, and then the sandspit turned white with muzzle flashes. They came at a run. Nearly 1,000 men of the Imperial Japanese Army, bayonets fixed, screaming as they crossed 200 feet of open sand. The Marines dug in on the far bank had been there 4 days. They had strung a strand of barbed wire, sighted their machine guns to fire down the length of the spit, rather than across it, and registered their 37mm canister guns on the exact spot where the sand narrowed. When the first flare went up, the crossing was lit like a stage, and the men running across it had nowhere to go but forward. The Marine gunners fired until their barrels glowed, and the water in their cooling jackets boiled away. By dawn, the sandspit was carpeted with bodies. By afternoon, Marine tanks were driving over them. 777 Japanese soldiers died there in a few hours. The Marines lost roughly 40. The colonel who ordered that attack, Colonel Ichiki, was dead before the sun was high, and his regimental colors were burning in the sand. What made the Tenaru a turning point was not the body count. It was the reason those men charged at all. They charged because their commander had been told, by the highest levels of Japanese planning, that the enemy across that river was soft, sick, demoralized, and about 2,000 strong. He was wrong about every one of those things. There were more than 11,000 United States Marines on Guadalcanal that night, and the report written about that sandspit began a process that would take the Imperial Japanese Army 3 years to complete. The slow, humiliating rewriting of everything it believed about how to fight Americans. By the end, the finest offensive commanders Japan possessed would issue their men an order that contradicted the entire spirit of Japanese infantry doctrine. Do not charge them. Do not die gloriously. Make them come to you, and make every yard cost them blood. That order is the real answer to what Japanese commanders thought of United States Marines, and it is far more disturbing than any propaganda broadcast ever produced. To understand why the Tenaru was such a shock, you have to understand what the Japanese army believed about itself in the summer of 1942. It had spent 5 years in China against poorly equipped and poorly led opponents, where aggressive night attacks with the bayonet worked again and again. Then it had spent 6 months conquering the Pacific at a speed that astonished the world. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore surrendered 80,000 British Empire troops to a Japanese force less than half that size. The lesson drawn in Japanese staff colleges was not that Japan had achieved surprise, concentration, and air superiority. The lesson was that spiritual power decided battles. Officers were taught that Western armies, and Americans in particular, were products of a soft, materialistic culture. They would fight while they had superiority in machines, take the machines away, hit them at night, hit them with the bayonet, and they would break and run. This was not fringe thinking. It was the operating assumption of an entire officer corps. Ichiki was that doctrine made flesh. A former infantry instructor and bayonet specialist, he had been the officer on the ground at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937 when the incident that started the war with China unfolded. Ordered to retake Henderson Field, he did not wait for his second echelon, his artillery, or his heavy weapons. He landed with roughly 900 men at Taivu Point on August 18th and marched west. When his advance patrol was wiped out by Marines, who then recovered his maps and unit insignia, he did not slow down. 3 days after landing, he attacked a reinforced Marine battalion frontally, at night across a sandbar, into prepared, interlocking fire. And here is the detail that mattered most to the officers who studied it afterward. The Marines did not break. Men in the forward positions had Japanese soldiers physically in their holes, and the fight was settled with knives and entrenching tools and rifle butts, and the line held. In the morning, instead of consolidating, the Marines crossed upstream, enveloped the survivors, and pinned them against the sea. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock had done exactly what Japanese doctrine said Americans could not do. He had absorbed a night bayonet assault and immediately gone over to the offensive. The reports reaching 17th Army headquarters at Rabaul were not believed. The prevailing view was that Ichiki had blundered, that he had attacked with too few men. The solution proposed was not a change of method, but more men using the same method. In September, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi took roughly 6,000 troops through the jungle and attacked a ridge held by about 800 Marine raiders and paratroopers under Colonel Merritt Edson. Over 2 nights, the Marine line was pushed back to a final knoll a few hundred yards from the airfield, and Edson walked among his men in the open, while machine gun fire cracked past him, and the line held again. Kawaguchi lost well over 800 men on ground that became known as Bloody Ridge. In October, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake tried a third time with an entire division and lost thousands more against the same perimeter. 3 attacks, each larger, each built on the same assumption, each broken. Somewhere in that sequence the assumption died, and we know it because of paper. Japanese soldiers were prolific diarists, and American intelligence teams on Guadalcanal collected an enormous volume of diaries, order books and unit reports abandoned in the retreat. Those diaries are a record of a belief system collapsing in real time. The early entries are confident. Later ones describe an enemy who does not behave the way the men were told he would. They describe Marines who fired at sound in the dark instead of panicking, who kept firing when their positions were overrun, who came out at first light to take back the ground rather than waiting for orders. They describe artillery arriving within a minute of a target being spotted. They describe starvation, because the supply line had been cut and men were boiling roots and eating grass. The Japanese called it the Island of Death. By the evacuation in February 1943, Japan had lost something on the order of 20,000 men there, and something less tangible and far more expensive. It had lost the belief that spirit alone could beat Americans in a straight fight. What replaced that belief at first was not respect, it was a lie. If Marines fought that way, they could not be normal soldiers, so a story was manufactured to explain them. Japanese troops were told that the United States Marine Corps was not a regular military organization at all, that Marines were criminals released from American prisons on condition that they fight. Some versions went further, claiming a man had to commit a murder to qualify, or kill his own parents to prove he had no ties left to break. It was crude, and it served 2 purposes. It explained the ferocity without conceding that ordinary Americans could fight, and it made surrender unthinkable, which suited a command that had already decided its soldiers would not surrender. The tragedy is that it fed a cycle. Japanese troops who believed they would be tortured if captured, fought to the last man or feigned surrender and detonated grenades, and Marines who saw that happen once stopped taking chances, and the Pacific spiraled into a mutual refusal of quarter that defined every island still to come. But propaganda is what commanders say, doctrine is what commanders believe, and the doctrine began to change. Was Tarawa forced it? In November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Betio, an island smaller than New York's Central Park. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had roughly 4,800 men and had spent months turning that sandbar into the most heavily fortified ground per square yard in the Pacific. 500 pillboxes, coconut log bunkers reinforced with sand and steel, 8-inch coastal guns, a seawall along the beaches. He is said to have told his garrison that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. Whether he used those exact words is disputed, but it captures the confidence of the defense, and the entire plan rested on the old principle: destroy the Americans at the water's edge before they establish a foothold. For a few hours on November 20th it nearly worked. The tide was wrong. Landing craft grounded on the reef hundreds of yards out, and Marines waded in through chest-deep water under interlocking machine gun fire, with no cover of any kind. Men died by the hundreds before touching dry sand. The survivors lay stacked behind the seawall, while officers tried to find out who was still alive. And then, in 1s and 2s, and then in squads, they went over it. What followed was a 76-hour close-quarters killing match in which Marines reduced pillbox after pillbox with demolition charges and flamethrowers, one at a time, in the open. Shibasaki was killed on the first day. Of the entire garrison, 17 Japanese combat personnel were taken alive, along with about 129 Korean laborers. Everyone else was dead. The Marines lost around 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in 3 days on an island you could walk across in 15 minutes. In America, Tarawa was a scandal, and Congress demanded explanations. In Tokyo, Tarawa was studied, and the conclusion was the opposite one. The staff concluded that the water's edge defense had failed, not because the fortifications were weak, but because American naval gunfire could smother a beach position, and because Marines, once ashore in any strength, could not be pushed back off. Over 1944, the Japanese Army developed a new doctrine for island warfare. Its core was a honeycombed complex of caves, tunnels, and reverse slope positions built inland out of reach of direct naval fire, designed not to prevent a landing but to bleed the landing force for as long as physically possible. The beaches would be given up, the high ground would be hollowed out, and the banzai charge, the emotional heart of Japanese infantry practice, was to be curtailed and in some commands forbidden outright, because it emptied a garrison in a single night and gave the Americans exactly the target they wanted. Consider what that means. An institution that had staked its identity on offensive spirit formally instructed its officers to stop attacking these particular Americans, not out of cowardice, out of arithmetic. In a straight exchange, the Marines could absorb the losses and the Japanese could not. The first commander to apply it fully was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa on Peleliu. He looked at the shattered coral spine called the Umurbrogol and saw a fortress naval shells could not reach. His engineers drove more than 500 caves into it, some on multiple levels with ventilation shafts, blast walls angled to defeat flamethrower streams, sliding steel doors and interior galleries, so a gun knocked out on one face could be replaced from inside the hill. Artillery was mounted on rails, rolled out to fire, rolled back before counter-battery could answer. Every approach was covered from at least 2 other positions. He gave his men written instructions whose central order no Japanese regimental commander had ever had to give. Fight from the caves, hold the ground, do not throw yourselves away in a charge. The 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944, expecting 4 days. It took 73. The Umurbrogol became Bloody Nose Ridge. Temperatures on the coral passed 110 degrees, and there was no fresh water. The 1st Marine Regiment under Louis Puller lost more than half its strength in about a week and had to be pulled off the island entirely. There was no flank to turn, only the cave-by-cave reduction of a position designed to make that as expensive as possible. Nakagawa held until late November, burned his colors, and took his own life. He was promoted posthumously, and then came the officer who understood Americans better than any of them, and, therefore, feared them most precisely. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was 53 when he took command of Iwo Jima. What set him apart was that he had lived in the United States, spending roughly 2 years there in the late 1920s as a military attaché and student, traveling widely, buying a car and driving across the country, studying American industry firsthand. He came away convinced that the United States was the last country on earth Japan should ever fight, because its industrial capacity was effectively bottomless. He did not believe in the war. He served anyway, and he understood he had been handed a death sentence, that no relief would come, and that the only question available to him was how expensive he could make 8 square miles of volcanic ash. He sent home the officers who argued for a beach defense. He put nearly every man underground. His engineers excavated an estimated 11 miles of tunnels through rock where sulfur fumes limited men to short shifts. Gun positions were built with muzzles barely protruding, sighted to fire into the flanks of advancing troops rather than to their front. Baron Taikichi Nishi, Olympic gold medalist in equestrian jumping at the 1932 Los Angeles Games, commanded the tank regiment and buried his tanks to their turrets as fixed strongpoints rather than lose them in the open. Kuribayashi issued instructions known as the courageous battle vows. Each man was to kill 10 Americans before dying. There would be no surrender, and, explicitly, repeatedly, there would be no banzai charge. No man was to throw away his life attacking when he could take lives from a firing position instead. That order was the culmination of everything learnt since a colonel ran his regiment into a sandspit on Guadalcanal 30 months earlier. Its author was a man writing letters home to his wife and young daughter about the drafty kitchen he wanted fixed, doing his household arithmetic while preparing to be killed. The Marines landed on February 19, 1945, and for several hundred yards almost nothing happened. Kuribayashi had ordered his gunners to hold fire until the beaches were crowded. The ash was too loose to dig in and too soft for vehicles, and when the guns opened up they fired into a mass of men who could neither advance quickly nor take cover. What followed was 36 days of exactly the combat he had designed. Marines took a ridge and were fired on from inside it. They cleared a bunker and it was reoccupied through a tunnel from behind. The flag raising on Suribachi happened on the 5th day, and the fighting continued for a month afterward. In ground the Marines named the Meat Grinder. Kuribayashi kept issuing orders long after Tokyo had written the island off, apologized in his final messages for failing to hold it, and died in the last days of March. His body was never definitively identified. Here is the number that settles the argument. Iwo Jima was the only major battle of the Pacific War in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. Roughly 21,000 defenders inflicted around 26,000 American casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead. 27 medals of honor were awarded for that one island, more than for any other engagement in American history. He achieved it with no air support, no naval support, no reinforcement, no resupply, and no hope. He built the entire defense around a single certainty, that the men coming at him would keep coming until every last position was destroyed. That is the compliment. He did not plan for Marines to falter, or hesitate, or lose heart. He planned for them to come, and keep coming, and he was right. The final expression came at Okinawa, where Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's senior operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, argued for pure attrition. Give up the north, dig into the Shuri line, and make the Americans grind forward, because every week Okinawa held was a week Japan was not invaded. It nearly followed his script exactly, except that in early May the more aggressive officers on the staff insisted over his objection on a large counteroffensive. The old doctrine had one last say. The attack went in on May 4th, was smashed by American firepower in about 2 days, and cost the 32nd Army roughly 5,000 men it could not replace. Yahara had predicted the failure for precisely the reasons Guadalcanal had established 3 years earlier. He was overruled, and he was right. Ordered by Ushijima to survive and tell what had happened, he was captured, and his account of the battle remains the most valuable Japanese assessment we have of being on the receiving end of an American amphibious campaign. When American interrogators sat down with captured Japanese officers after the surrender, the same themes returned again and again. They spoke about the volume and responsiveness of American firepower, with something close to disbelief. They spoke about logistics, about isolated American units eating hot food and receiving mail while Japanese garrisons a few hundred yards away starved. But the assessments that concerned Marines kept coming back to something harder to quantify: the refusal of small units to disintegrate. Japanese doctrine had been built on the idea that killing the officers and attacking at night would make an enemy line come apart. What their commanders reported, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, was that Marine squads with their officers dead and their radios out and their flanks gone did not come apart. They dug in where they stood and kept shooting and were still there in the morning. That is what Japanese commanders really thought about United States Marines, and it was never expressed as praise because it could not be. It was expressed as fear, translated into engineering. Every mile of tunnel on Iwo Jima, every cave mouth in the Umurbrogol, every reverse slope gun position on the Shuri line was a statement about an enemy that could not be shocked into breaking and could only be made to pay. The propaganda about convicts and murderers was for the enlisted men. The doctrine was for the officers, and it said something simpler and darker. They will not stop, so we will not charge. We cannot beat them, so we will make the price of beating us unbearable. In the end, it said the most damning thing an army can say about the enemy across the water, that the only strategy left was to die slowly enough to matter. Kuribayashi's letters were published in Japan, and are read there as the private thoughts of a man who saw exactly what was coming, and did his duty anyway. Yahara's account of Okinawa is still on professional reading lists. The tunnels on Iwo Jima are still there, sealed and unexplored in most places, and the island remains closed except for a handful of commemorative visits, where American and Japanese veterans and their descendants have met on the black sand to shake hands. The Umurbrogol is still a ruined coral maze, where recovery teams continue to find remains, and the sandspit at the mouth of the Ilu River, where it began, is a quiet, ordinary-looking stretch of beach. Somewhere in the archives of that war is a document written by a Japanese staff officer instructing his men not to attack, and it is worth remembering how extraordinary a thing that was to write. An army that had told its soldiers for a generation that spirit conquers steel, told them at the end to stay in the hole and wait, because the men coming up the hill were not going to break. That is the verdict. It was never spoken out loud, and no Japanese commander ever said it to an American face. They built it into the ground instead, 11 miles of it, in the dark, in the sulfur. And it is still there. If this story meant something to you, take a second to hit like. It genuinely helps these forgotten accounts reach more people. Subscribe if you want more of them, because there are hundreds still buried in the archives waiting to be told. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether you had family in the Pacific. This community stretches from Oklahoma to Okinawa, and every one of you is part of keeping these men from being forgotten. Thank you for watching.